They say the desert holds great secrets. In New Mexico, where the shadows of ancient Pueblo natives stretch across the red sands and the wind whispers in tongues older than memory, some secrets refuse to stay buried. Tonight I take you to the enchanted land, but I promise you, what you hear will be anything but enchanting. 3 true stories, 3 places, 3 encounters that will challenge everything you think you know about the American Southwest. What lies hidden in abandoned mines? What watches from the mesas? And why do locals refuse to say certain names after dark? Stay with me, because when you hear these stories, you'll understand why New Mexico's beauty hides something far more terrifying. And if you're new here, welcome to your nightmare. Hit the subscribe button, because we're just getting started. Let's go. The Magdalena Mountains have swallowed more than their share of miners over the decades, but Shaft 7 of the old Kelly mine took something else entirely. It took souls. Jake Morrison didn't believe in ghosts when he arrived in Socorro County in the summer of 2008. A geologist from Boston, he'd come to survey the abandoned mining operations for a historical preservation project, armed with nothing but his equipment, his skepticism, and a head full of scientific explanations for everything. The locals at the Desert Rose Diner warned him. Old Maria, the waitress who'd served coffee in that place for 40 years, actually grabbed his wrist when he mentioned Shaft 7. Her eyes went wide, pupils dilating like she'd seen death itself. "That one stays closed, mijo," she whispered, her voice crackling like old paper. "There's a reason they sealed it with concrete and rebar in 1952. Some doors are meant to stay shut." But Jake was a man of science, and science doesn't bow to superstition. On July 15th, armed with his hard hat, flashlight, and geological survey equipment, he cut through the rusted chain link fence that had stood for decades. The concrete seal had cracked over the years. Time and desert feet had done what warnings could not. The opening was just wide enough for a man to squeeze through if he didn't mind the claustrophobia. The shaft descended at a 45-degree angle, the old support beams groaning under the weight of decades. Jake's flashlight beam cut through absolute darkness, revealing walls that glistened with some kind of moisture, strange given the desert climate above. The air grew colder with each step, and heavier, like breathing through wet wool. At 200 feet down, his radio crackled, just static, though he was well within range of the surface repeater. That's when he found the first handprint. Not on the wall, but pressed into it, as if the rock had been soft as clay when something touched it. The fingers were too long, the palm too narrow. Jake told himself it was a geological formation, pareidolia, the human brain's tendency to find patterns. He photographed it and moved on. The main chamber opened up at 300 feet, a cathedral of stone that shouldn't have existed according to his survey maps. And there, scattered across the floor like discarded toys, were helmets. Dozens of them, some from the 1940s, others newer, including one that still had the price tag from a hardware store in Socorro, dated 2003. Each helmet bore the same mark, 3 parallel scratches across the top, deep gouges that had torn through metal and plastic alike. Jake's scientific mind began to fracture. He spun slowly, his flashlight revealing more impossible things. Boot prints on the ceiling, tools embedded in the walls at impossible angles, and names. Hundreds of them, carved into every surface, each one scratched with desperate, ragged strokes. "Help us. It knows we're here. Don't look up. Shaft 7 hungers." That's when his flashlight died. Not a flicker, not a fade, just instant, absolute darkness so complete it felt solid. Jake fumbled for his backup light, and in those seconds of blindness, he heard it. A sound like breathing, but wrong. Too wet, too rhythmic, coming from above and below simultaneously, as if the entire shaft had become a throat. His backup light blazed to life, and Jake screamed. The ceiling wasn't rock anymore. It was moving, undulating, covered in something that looked like flesh but wasn't, couldn't be. And pressed into that impossible surface were faces, human faces, dozens of them, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide and aware. They were alive in there, consciousness trapped in living stone. One face turned towards him. Jake recognized him from a missing person poster he'd seen at the diner. Marcus Webb disappeared during a solo exploration in 2003. Marcus's mouth moved, forming words without sound. Run! Jake ran. He scrambled up that shaft faster than physics should have allowed, driven by pure animal terror. Behind him, the breathing sound grew louder, closer, and he could feel heat on his neck, breath that reeked of copper and earth, and something ancient and hungry. The walls themselves seemed to reach for him, stone fingers elongating from impossible surfaces. He exploded out of the shaft into the blinding desert sun, rolling across burning sand, not stopping until he was 50 feet away. When he looked back, the opening was different. The concrete seal was intact, unbroken, as if he never cut through it. The chain-link fence showed no signs of damage. Jake fled Socorro County that same day, leaving all his equipment behind. He never finished his survey, never filed his report. When the Historical Society called him for updates, he changed his number. When colleagues asked about his field work, he changed careers entirely. Now he sells insurance in Connecticut, as far from mines and mountains as he can get. But sometimes, late at night, he wakes up feeling stone cold and hearing that wet, rhythmic breathing. And in those moments of terror, before sleep reclaims him, Jake Morrison swears he can feel his face pressed against rock, his consciousness sinking slowly into darkness, joining the others in Shaft 7's eternal collection. The thing that lives there is patient. It's been waiting since before the first miners came, and it has all the time in the world to finish what it started. Make sure you're subscribed. These stories only get darker from here. Shiprock rises from the desert floor like a wound in reality, a jagged volcanic plug that native peoples called Se-Bit-Ai, the rock with wings. To the Navajo, it's sacred. To geologists, it's fascinating. To Sarah Chen, it became the place where she learned that some things are watching us, and have been for a very, very long time. Sarah was a photographer specializing in southwestern landscapes, and in October 2015, she received a commission from a major nature magazine to capture Shiprock at dawn. She'd photographed dangerous locations before: cliff edges in Yosemite, storm systems in Kansas, ice caves in Alaska, but nothing prepared her for what happened on that cold October morning. She arrived at 4:30 a.m., 3 hours before sunrise, wanting to set up her equipment and scout angles in the darkness. The Navajo guide she'd hired refused to take her to the formation itself. "Not at night," he said simply. "Never at night. You go in daylight, you show respect, and you leave before dark. That's the rule." When Sarah insisted she'd paid good money for this access, he drove away, leaving her at the roadside pull-off 3 miles from Shiprock's base. Stubborn and professional, Sarah shouldered her camera bag and tripod and began the hike in. Her headlamp carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness. The desert around Shiprock is flat, featureless, offering nowhere to hide, which made it impossible to explain why Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not the passive observation of animals or the paranoia of isolation, but focused, intelligent attention, like standing in a spotlight. At the base of Shiprock, she set up her primary camera facing east to capture the sunrise. While waiting for the light, she explored with her secondary camera, a digital model for test shots. That's when she noticed them through her viewfinder. Shapes, silhouettes, standing on the rock face about 60 feet up, in positions no human could possibly maintain on the sheer vertical surface. Sarah lowered the camera and looked with her naked eyes. Nothing. Just rock and shadow. She raised the camera again. There they were, 7 figures, humanoid but wrong, their proportions subtly off. Too tall, arms too long, heads tilted at angles that suggested broken mechs, and all of them facing her. Her rational mind supplied explanations: optical illusions, shadows cast by her headlamp, artifacts of the camera's digital sensor. But when she checked the LCD screen, her blood turned to ice. The figures weren't shadows. They had detail. She could see the texture of what might have been clothing or skin, see the suggestion of faces, if you could call them faces, dark hollows where eyes should be, mouths that stretched too wide. Sarah did what any professional photographer would do. She started shooting. Rapid-fire shots, different exposures, different angles. Every single image showed the figures, and in each successive photo, they were closer. Not moving between shots, but simply closer, as if the camera was somehow zooming in despite her not touching the lens. That's when her headlamp died, and her flashlight, and the LED displays on both cameras. Every electronic device she carried went dark simultaneously, leaving Sarah in absolute desert darkness with only starlight and shiprock looming above her like a tombstone. The stars were bright enough that she could see shapes, vague outlines. She stood perfectly still, every nerve screaming at her to run, but knowing that running blind in the desert meant broken ankles and death by exposure. So she waited, barely breathing, and watched as the starlight revealed something impossible. They were coming down the rock face, all 7 of them, not climbing, there was no climbing motion, but descending smoothly, as if gravity meant nothing to them, their 2 long limbs moving in ways that hurt to watch. The sound they made was worse than their appearance, a chorus of whispers in a language that predated words, syllables that seemed to bypass her ears entirely and form directly in her mind. You see us. You should not see us. You brought the eye that captures, the eye that steals. Sarah's camera, her digital camera, suddenly blazed to life in her hands, its screen impossibly bright in the darkness. Images flashed across the display at seizure-inducing speed. Not her photos, different images, ancient images, photographs that couldn't exist because they showed shiprock from angles only possible from the air. And they were in color, but they were dated 1880, 1723, 1592, dates going back further and further, before cameras, before Europeans, before history. And in every image, the 7 figures stood watching conquistadors, watching cavalry, watching Anasazi pueblos, watching dinosaurs. They'd been there, watching, since the rock rose from the earth 30 million years ago. The whispers grew louder in her mind. We watch, we record, we remember, and now we have seen you seeing us, the eye for the eye. Sarah felt something touch her, not physically, but deeper, as if invisible fingers reached into her skull and plucked at her optic nerves. The pain was exquisite and impossible to describe. She screamed and fell to her knees, her camera tumbling to the ground, and suddenly, everything stopped. Lights blazed. Her headlamp, flashlight, and cameras all powered on simultaneously. The figures were gone, the desert was empty. Dawn was breaking. Somehow 3 hours had passed in what felt like minutes. Sarah grabbed her equipment and ran, not bothering to collect her carefully positioned tripod and primary camera. She made it to the highway and flagged down a tribal police officer who happened to be passing by. She tried to explain what happened, but the words wouldn't come. Literally wouldn't come. Every time she tried to describe the figures, her throat closed up and her vision blurred. The officer, a Navajo man in his 50s, took one look at her face and nodded slowly. You went at night. You saw the watchers. You're lucky they let you leave. Sarah Chen never returned to New Mexico. Her magazine published the photos she'd taken before the encounter. Beautiful sunrise shots of shiprock that won awards. But the images from her digital camera, the ones showing the figures, gone. Completely erased. Even the recovery software found nothing. But sometimes, when Sarah looks through a camera viewfinder, any camera anywhere in the world, she sees them for just a fraction of a second, standing in the background, always watching, always there. The watchers of shiprock have added her to their eternal record, and some observations last forever. We're not done yet. The final story is the worst of all. Stay with me.
Every town has that one house, the one kids dare each other to approach, the one real estate agents can't sell, The one that stands empty for decades while everything around it changes. In Clovis, New Mexico, that house sits at 1447 Thornton Street. And what happened there in 2012 is why it will never be occupied again. The house itself isn't particularly remarkable. A modest two-story craftsman from the 1920s with a sagging porch and windows covered in grime. Paint peels from the siding in long, diseased-looking strips that curl away from the wood like dead skin. The yard is a tangle of dead weeds and sun-bleached debris, old newspapers, plastic bags caught in the dried brush, a rusted tricycle that no one remembers leaving there. The roof sags in the middle like a broken spine. The chimney leans at an angle that defies physics, as if the house itself is trying to collapse, but something won't let it. But what made it truly remarkable was the sound. Every resident of Thornton Street could tell you about the sound, though they'd all describe it slightly differently. Some said it was like a woman screaming. Others said it was wind through broken windows. A few, the ones who'd lived there longest, who'd heard it night after night for decades, said it sounded like the earth itself crying out in pain. Old Mr. Patterson, who had lived 3 doors down since 1967, said it sounded like his mother's voice calling him home, even though his mother had been dead for 40 years. Mrs. Chand at number 1439 said it sounded like the Buddhist chants for the dead, but backward, reversed, as if summoning something rather than sending it away. Young Marcus Webb, who lived across the street, swore it sounded like his own voice screaming, like the house was showing him his future. The screaming always started at 3:17 a.m., not approximately, exactly 3:17 a.m. You could set your watch by it. Several residents had, in fact, begun using the screaming as an alarm clock, a perverse adaptation to something they couldn't change or escape. Locals had gotten used to it over the decades, the way city dwellers get used to train whistles or foghorns or the wail of sirens. It was just part of living on Thornton Street. Most people stopped hearing it after a few months, their brains filtering it out as background noise, tucking it away in the same mental compartment where they stored the hum of refrigerators and the distant rumble of highway traffic. But newcomers always heard it. Always. And for the first few weeks, they'd wake in terror, heart pounding, certain someone was being murdered. Then they'd learn, then they'd adapt. Then they'd stopped hearing it too. That's how trauma works. The human mind is remarkably good at normalizing horror. Then came the Alvarez family. David and Jessica Alvarez bought the house in April 2012 for a price that should have been a red flag. $45,000 for a house that would cost $300,000 anywhere else in town. They were young, ambitious, full of HGTV-inspired dreams of exposed brick and open floor plans. They saw it as an investment property to flip, a diamond in the rough, a fixer-upper with potential. They had no children yet, just plans and a renovation budget they'd saved for 3 years. Jessica was a nurse at Plains Regional Medical Center, working night shifts in the ICU, where she'd learned to stay calm during crises. David worked as an electrician, a practical man who understood circuits and current and the logical flow of power. They were grounded people, skeptical of ghost stories and superstitions. They'd both grown up in religious households, but had drifted away from faith, preferring evidence and reason over belief and tradition. The real estate agent, a nervous woman named Patricia Gomez, who'd been trying to sell the property for 11 years, told them about the screaming. She was legally obligated to disclose it after a lawsuit in 2007 from previous buyers who'd lasted only 2 weeks. David laughed. Jessica said they'd lived near airports and train tracks before. How bad could it be? Patricia's hand shook as she gave them the keys. She didn't go inside with them. She never went inside. Not anymore. Not since 1998, when she'd gone in alone to take listing photos and emerged 4 hours later with no memory of what happened inside and a camera full of blank images. The first night, they heard the screaming. Unlike the neighbors, they couldn't dismiss it. They were inside the house, and inside the sound was different, clearer, more articulate, more purposeful, more intimate. It had words, though words in no language David or Jessica recognized. The syllables were harsh, guttural, ancient. The sound seemed to come from the walls themselves, vibrating through the structure like a living thing moving through a body's nervous system. The windows rattled in their frames and dust sifted down from the ceiling in small, continuous waterfalls. The floorboards thrummed with it. Jessica felt it in her teeth and in her bones in the hollows of her skull. David felt it in his chest, as if the sound was trying to match his heartbeat, to synchronize with it, to take control of it. David, practical and stubborn, assumed it was pipes or structural settling or wind through the walls. Old houses made all sorts of noises. Every old building was a symphony of creaks and groans and mysterious sounds. They'd deal with it during the renovation. Maybe install some insulation, seal up the drafts, replace the old plumbing. They lasted 3 more nights. Each night the screaming grew louder, more insistent, more desperate, more personal. By the 3rd night, Jessica swore she could almost understand it, could almost make out the shape of words in that horrific chorus. Words like help and trapped and still here and something that sounded disturbingly like her own name. On the 4th night, the night of April 19th, 2012, something changed. Something fundamental shifted in the house, like a door opening that had been closed for decades. Jessica woke at 3:17 a.m. to the screaming, but this time, David wasn't beside her. The bed was still warm where he'd been, the impression of his body still visible in the sheets. But he was gone. She found him standing in the hallway, facing the wall at the top of the stairs, his hands pressed flat against the plaster like he was trying to push through it or pull something out of it. He was completely naked, though he'd gone to bed in pajamas. His skin was covered in a fine layer of dust, pale and ghostly in the dim light from the bedroom, making him look like a statue, like something carved from marble. He was whispering something, over and over, a chant or prayer or confession. His voice was barely audible beneath the screaming that filled the house like floodwater, like rising water in a drowning room.
"They're still here," he whispered. "They're in the walls. They're in the foundation. They never left. They're still dying. They're dying right now. They've been dying for decades. The dying never stops. Can you hear them? Can you hear them dying? They want out. They want to breathe. They want to see the sky. They've been buried alive. All of them. Buried alive and conscious, aware, screaming for decades. Decades of screaming. Can you imagine? Can you imagine screaming for decades?" Jessica tried to pull him away, grabbing his shoulders, shaking him, calling his name, slapping his face. Anything to break whatever trance had taken him. But David was rigid, unmoving, a statue of flesh and bone. His muscles were locked, frozen, as if rigor mortis had set in while he still lived. His fingers began to sink into the plaster, not breaking through it, but sinking into it, as if the wall was becoming soft, accepting him, welcoming him home like a parent embracing a lost child. The plaster rippled around his hands like the surface of disturbed water, like flesh accepting a knife. Jessica screamed and pulled harder, digging her heels into the old wooden floor, using all her strength, all her nurse's training in moving dead weight. Finally, David stumbled backward, his hands coming free with a sound like suction breaking, like a boot being pulled from deep mud, like birth in reverse. Where his hands had been, the plaster was different, stained, dark, wet, glistening. And if you looked closely, and Jessica did look, frozen in horror and fascination, unable to look away, you could see impressions in those stains. Human shapes, bodies, dozens of them layered one atop another like archaeological strata. Faces pressed against the inside of the walls as if trying to break through. Mouths open in eternal silent screams. Hands reaching. Eyes wide with terror that had never faded, never dulled, never found release. Some faces were fresh, detailed, every feature visible. Some were older, more degraded, fading into the plaster like photographs left too long in sunlight. In the bathroom, she found a child's face. In the kitchen, she found hands reaching upward, toward where the ceiling would be, grasping for escape that never came. In the living room, she found lovers intertwined, even in death, still holding each other. And in the basement, God, the basement.
Jessica almost didn't go down there. Almost. But the pull was too strong, the compulsion too overwhelming. The stairs creaked under her weight, each step protesting. The air grew colder as she descended and damper, thick with moisture that had no source in the desert climate. The stains there were darkest, the impressions deepest, the shapes most defined. She found names carved into the foundation itself, hundreds of names, each one scored into the concrete with what must have been fingernails, given the ragged, desperate quality of the letters. Some names she recognized, from the local cemetery, from obituaries she'd read, from missing person posters she'd seen at the post office. Others were foreign, strange, names that suggested different eras, different origins, different lives cut short. Maria Sanchez, John Doe number 7, William something. The last name was too damaged to read. Chen, Giuseppe, Running Bear, Yuki. Names in English, Spanish, Italian, Chinese, Japanese, Navajo. Languages she couldn't identify, alphabets she didn't recognize. And beneath the names, messages. Hundreds of messages. Thousands. God forgive him. Let me out. I'm still alive. Help us. The mortar is made of us. We are the house. 1924. He promised burial. He lied. Still breathing. Can't die. Won't let us die. Trapped atween. Not alive, not dead. Screaming forever. You'll join us. Everyone joins us. The house grows. Always room for more. The ambulance came. Paramedics found Jessica sitting on the basement floor, staring at the walls, her phone's battery dead, darkness surrounding her. She didn't remember how long she'd been down there. David was hospitalized for 3 days with what doctors called a dissociative episode brought on by severe stress and possible environmental toxins. They ran tests for carbon monoxide, mold, lead, asbestos, every environmental hazard they could think of. Everything came back negative. When he came home pale and hollow-eyed and speaking only in monosyllables, they packed immediately. They left everything, furniture, tools, their renovation dreams, photo albums, wedding gifts, Jessica's grandmother's china, David's comic book collection, everything they owned. They walked away from their investment, their equity, their future. The house could have the $45,000. The house could have it all. They left the keys on the kitchen counter and never looked back. But the story doesn't end there. It never does, with these places. The Historical Society, intrigued by Jessica's testimony and the photographs she'd taken in the basement before her phone died, did some research. What they found made the local news, though the story was quickly buried after pressure from city officials who didn't want Clovis associated with such horrors, who feared property values would plummet, who worried about tourism and reputation.
The house at 1447 Thornton Street was built in 1924 by a man named Elias Thornton, the street's namesake, a pillar of the community, respected businessman, deacon at First Baptist Church. Thornton was a mortician, but not a legal one. He offered discount services for families who couldn't afford proper funerals during the Depression when death was common and money was scarce. He was seen as a charitable man, a good Christian helping those in need. What he actually did was take bodies that no one claimed, drifters, criminals, the desperately poor, undocumented immigrants, prostitutes, mentally ill patients from the state hospital, anyone whose disappearance wouldn't be investigated, anyone whose death wouldn't be mourned, and instead of burying them as he promised, he built them into the foundation and walls of his house. He used their remains as literal structure, mixing crushed bones with concrete, pressing bodies into wall cavities before sealing them with plaster, using human hair mixed with horsehair plaster for texture and strength, creating mortar from rendered human fat. He kept meticulous records, found after his death in a locked trunk, names, dates, where each body was placed in the structure. 217 souls he recorded, 217 additions to his house, 217 voices for his choir, as he called it in his journal. An estimated 200 bodies went into that house between 1924 and 1947, when Thornton himself died mysteriously in the basement. According to the coroner's report, he was found face down in wet concrete that had somehow liquefied around him, though it had been solid for 20 years. His body was pulled from the foundation, but his face had been pressed into the concrete with such force that his features were obliterated, flattened, erased. Like something had held him down, had pushed him under, had made him part of the structure he'd created. Like his victims had finally found a way to reach back, to claim him, to make him experience what they'd experienced. The screaming started the night of his death and has continued every night since at exactly 3:17 a.m., the time of Thornton's death, according to the coroner's report. Some say it's the victims, crying out for the justice they never received. Others say it's Thornton himself, experiencing the terror he inflicted 200 times over every single night for eternity. A few, the ones who study such things, who believe in patterns and cosmic justice, say it's both, forever intertwined, predator and prey, bound together in an endless loop of suffering. The city has tried to demolish the house 3 times. Each time, workers refused to continue after the first day. The first demolition crew in 1989 reported their equipment moving on its own. A bulldozer that started itself at 3:17 a.m. and drove in circles, a wrecking ball that swung toward workers instead of walls, tools that flew through the air. The second attempt, in 2003, ended when workers reported seeing faces in the plaster dust. Dozens of faces swirling in the debris, mouths moving, trying to speak, trying to warn or threaten or plead. The most recent attempt, in 2019, ended when an excavator operator named Tom Briggs swore he heard names being called from inside the walls, including his own. His full name, his childhood nickname, the pet name his dead wife used to call him, names that should have been private, secret, known only to him. He abandoned the excavator, left it running, and walked off the job, never came back. The city had to hire a different company to retrieve the equipment, and those workers reported the excavator's Kevin smelled like death, and the seat was stained with something dark that wouldn't come clean. Today, 1447 Thornton Street stands empty. The city has given up. They've simply fenced it off with chain link topped with barbed wire and declared it structurally unsound, a danger to public safety, off limits to everyone. But every night, at 3:17 a.m., the house screams, every single night, without fail, without exception, and sometimes, on particularly quiet nights when the wind is still and the desert holds its breath, residents swear they can hear something else beneath the screaming. Words, pleas, 200 voices begging from inside the walls to be let out, to be freed, to be given the burial they were promised and denied, to be allowed to finally die. David Alvarez never recovered. He lives with his sister in Albuquerque now in a small apartment with thin walls where he can hear the neighbors, where sound proves the walls are hollow, empty, safe. He doesn't work. He doesn't speak much. He takes medication that keeps him calm, docile, manageable. But every night, at exactly 3:17 a.m., he wakes up and walks to the nearest wall and presses his hands against it, whispering to whatever he thinks lives inside. His sister has learned to guide him back to bed, to whisper that it's okay, that he's safe, that the house is far away. But sometimes, in those moments, David whispers back, "They're calling me. They want me to come home. They say there's still room in the walls. There's always room for one more. They're making space for me. They've been making space since I left. They're waiting. They're patient. They have all the time in the world." Jessica left New Mexico entirely. She works as a traveling nurse now, never staying anywhere longer than 13 weeks, never signing a lease,
always ready to move, to flee, to escape. She can't live in the same place too long, can't get attached to walls, can't sleep in the same room more than a few months. Because sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, she hears it, faint and distant but unmistakable, carried across hundreds of miles by some connection she can't break. The screaming. And she knows that 1447 Thornton Street hasn't forgotten her. The house remembers everyone who enters. The house keeps records just like Elias Thornton did. And the house is patient. The house has been waiting since 1924, adding to its collection one soul at a time. And it's not done yet. It's never done. There's always room for one more.